Hey, do you prefer to find the joy in life, or do you just want some help with that? If so, you're in the right place. So come on in and join the Joy Bunny clan. This is the My Slice of Life podcast. Goths are drawn to him. The Simpsons did a parody of his famous poem The Raven. He is considered the father of fictional detective stories, and his life seems to have been as unhappy as his portraits convey. It can only be Edgar Allan Poe. Welcome back to the My Slice of Life podcast with me, Sharon, your very own Highland host, and this week I'm bringing you yet another weird mystery to delve into and unravel. What I'm not going to do this week, though, is to tell you to check the links in the description, like, follow, and all that sort of stuff, because I'm pretty sure you know what to do by now. I'm not promising I'll never remind you again, because my memory's pretty much useless at this point, and I would just be lying if I said that. So, what I do want to do, though, is bring you this strange mystery which surrounds the death of Edgar Allan Poe, because it's actually not just his death that was weird. I mean, that's the mystery part, but his life was pretty unusual too, so I thought this would be a good one. I mean, he was missing for nearly a week before he died, and when he was found, the circumstances were strange to say the least. But what exactly is known about the death of Edgar Allan Poe, and how much has been fabricated throughout the years? Luckily, you do not need to ponder over a midnight dreary to find out, as this is our mystery file for the week. So get your coffee and get comfy, because we are in for a bumpy ride on this one. Now, when you think of Edgar Allan Poe, I'm going to guess you probably think of the poem The Raven that I mentioned, and those unhappy-looking black and white photos you'll have seen of him. But do you think of much else, though? If you don't really know much about him, you really are in for one or two surprises here. But as always, we'll go back to the beginning for a little bit of background. Little Edgar Poe was born January 19th, 1809, in Boston, and he was the second child of actors David and Elizabeth, known as Eliza Poe. Now, he was their second son, and soon he had a little sister too. But in 1810, David, his father, abandoned the family, leaving Eliza to look after her three young children on her own. Then, only 1 year later, Eliza contracted tuberculosis and spent the last few months of her life in Richmond. She died on December the 8th, 1811, at the age of 24. Little Edgar was only 2 years old. So already we have a pretty grim start to this man's life, but strap in, Joy Bunnies, because, spoiler alert, he looks miserable in those portraits for a reason. Now, little Edgar was separated from his brother and sister. He was taken in by a Richmond couple, John and Frances Allen, but he was never officially adopted by them, and this seems to be the root of constant tensions between him and his foster father. And instead of taking their last name, he just put it in the middle, and that's how he became Edgar Allan Poe. He never got rid of the Poe, he kept that. Now, for a while, things were pretty cheery, and as a teenager, Poe enjoyed the life of the elite upper class, so, not all bad then. Then at the ripe old age of 17, Edgar attended the University of Virginia to study ancient and modern languages. And even though he was so young, he left behind a fiancée, one Miss Elmira Royster, who promised to wait until after his graduation to get married. Now, this is Edgar Allan Poe, so you know there's going to be a bit of doom and gloom, and unfortunately for our Edgar, he ran into financial problems pretty much immediately while at university. By all accounts, he was a talented student, but he didn't have enough funds for the college tuition. Some reports I've read say this is because his foster father ran into financial difficulties, but a majority say it's because his foster father wouldn't support him financially, despite him being very well off thanks to his tobacco business and then a large inheritance. Now, this then resulted in more friction between the two of them. It sounded like the foster father could well have given him enough money to see him through his full education, but didn't. Either way, whatever way it happened, to raise the necessary funds, Edgar thought gambling would be the way to do it. Turns out it wasn't, and instead he ended up $2,000 in debt, and it's even said he resorted to burning his own furniture to keep warm in the winter. Around 6 months at university, he returned home to more battles with his foster father, and worse still, Elmira had become engaged to someone else. Yeah, so much for waiting. Actually though, what seems to have happened when I was reading into it was that while Edgar was off at uni, Elmira's father had been intercepting Edgar's letters, and then he kind of, working his magic to turn her to another man who showed more promise. And, the kind of, he's not writing to you, he's not bothered about you, he's forgotten, you need to get on with your life. Oh, look, here's a nice, perfect suitor for you. And that's kind of the way she went. So Poe, heartbroken, nothing else to do really, he moved to Boston. He didn't stay long, but during that time he published his first book of poetry, albeit under another name. Now at this point, I want to point out this guy moved a lot. So I want to give you the main pointers today instead of a total rundown of every town he visited, because I don't think that's going to help solve the mystery that we're here to do today. So when he was 18, he decided the army was the place to be so he could support his writing. He'd be getting paid, and he joined under the name Edgar A. Perry. Apparently he enlisted on May the 26th, 1827, which just so happens to be my birthday. The May the 26th part, thank you, not the 1827 bit. Don't be getting cheeky now. Anyway, he served for a brief period, and he did pretty well before he was thinking to himself, no, this isn't for me, and made attempts to get himself dismissed, which he eventually was. He also attended West Point in New York, but he struggled there as well, and he was expelled after about 8 months, give or take, for not attending classes or drills for a whole week. Now, he'd been writing poetry while in the army, and when he got expelled, this was really when he declared a firm wish to, I want to be a poet and a writer. And of course, Alan, his foster father, wasn't happy, so this is really kind of when they went their separate ways. Up until now, Poe had written poetry and had been published, but it wasn't working out the way he hoped. Yeah, I know that feeling. Feel free to check out A Plate Full of Poetry on Amazon. Anyway, Poe then switched his focus to writing prose, and he spent the next several years working for literary journals and periodicals, becoming known for his own style of literary criticism. And now this work, it forced him to move a lot between several cities, including Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York. Like I said, he moved around a lot, but it also meant that he developed a few foes in the literary world because of his style of criticism. At one point, Poe ended up living with his aunt, Maria Clem, and her daughter, Virginia. Now, if you don't know this part of his story, this is where things get a little more bumpy. You see, one story says Poe started having feelings for Virginia, who was his cousin, and some say he was only trying to help her out so she didn't have to marry some horrible guy. I don't know who the horrible guy was, but they're trying to say, no, he was trying to help, this is why he did it, he was trying to help her and be nice to her. Either way, the two of them got married in Richmond in 1836, when Poe was 27, and Virginia, his cousin, remember, was only 13. Yeah, I told you it was going to get bumpy, didn't I? However, Poe and Virginia, they were married for 11 years, and yes, there is a lot of speculation about what kind of marriage they actually had, but nobody's ever going to know now. Whatever really happened, his life did seem to settle a bit at this point. For a while at least, he was writing short stories, and it said this was when he invented the first detective story, the real first whodunit. Yes, it's thanks to Edgar Allan Poe that we have Sherlock Holmes and all the other famous literary detectives that we know and love so well. I didn't know that, so I liked finding that out. But at this point, I would also like to touch on the topic of Poe's alcoholism. It said he was drinking really heavily while he attended university, and that it was something he always struggled with throughout his life. But one thing you should know about him is that he also had some sort of condition which meant He couldn't tolerate alcohol, so like one small glass of wine was enough to get him severely intoxicated. He just couldn't handle it. Now, there are some theories out there which suggest he may have had a brain tumour which caused this effect on him, but I wanted to bring it up because it plays a very important part in the story later on. And it's also important to know that his brother died of alcoholism and his sister also struggled with the demon drink. Now, does that mean it's hereditary? Does that mean there was some condition that we don't know what all three of them had? Or did they all have tumours? Or was he the only one with a tumour and they were genuinely just alcoholics? No idea, but they all seem to have got hit with it. And him anyway, he couldn't handle his alcohol at all. Like I say, one small glass of wine, and you would have thought he'd had bottles and bottles of it. That didn't stop him though. When he went through periods apparently where he would stop drinking and then he would go back to drinking, on off, that it plagued him throughout his life. But there was some light in this time period, however, as it was in 1845, Poe's poem, The Raven, was published and he became an overnight success. Hooray! Unfortunately, by this time his wife Virginia began to show symptoms of tuberculosis. She was sick for a couple of years and she actually died in 1847 while the couple lived in New York, and she was only 24 years old. And it is said that Poe never truly recovered from her death, and I suppose that's evident in a lot of his writing from the time. So Poe, broken-hearted again, began to drift back south towards the city of his childhood, Richmond. And it was here that Edgar and his first fiancée, Elmira Royster Shelton, remember her? I'll wait for you after graduation. Well, they got back together. By now, she was a happy, wealthy little widow, but her kids weren't too happy about the relationship, especially when they got engaged in 1849. So yeah, truly heartbroken about Virginia then, because this is only 2 years later. But I can say that, it's a different time, different attitudes. I don't know, I'm not in the man's head. So Poe's plan was to move permanently to Richmond to be with Elmira. And he was going to go to New York to bring Maria, his mother-in-law, back to live with them all in Richmond, and he was also planning to see a client in Philadelphia on the way up the coast. Lots of plans, but would they come to fruition? No, of course not. This is Edgar Allan Poe and everything's miserable. So what happened next? Well, before he left for his trip, Elmira had been concerned about his health because it wasn't long previously he'd had a bout of cholera and he was showing signs of fever and just general ill health. So she'd convinced him to see a doctor before he left, which he did, apparently. Some say it was more of a social visit, he just basically had dinner with the guy and then left. However, after that, there is no record of his whereabouts from September the 27th until October the 3rd. Remember, this is in 1849. So remember right at the start, I said he disappeared for nearly a week, I think it's 5 days before he died. Well, that's this period of time. Nobody has a clue where he went or what happened to him. Then on October the 3rd, Poe was found and was described as delirious. He was thought to be drunk out of his mind when he was found outside a tavern known as Gunner's Hall by a man named Joseph Walker. Now this Mr. Walker, he recognised the famed author. But what he noticed was that Poe was dressed in threadbare, ill-fitted clothing, which was unusual to say the least because he was known to be a good dresser. This guy dressed well and he was known for that. Yet here he was in rags, basically convulsing in a gutter. So Walker offered to help and he asked Poe if he knew anybody nearby that he could contact for him. Now, for as ill as Poe was, he was able to say he knew an editor named Joseph Snodgrass. So the guy Walker got Snodgrass there, and when he arrived, he saw what kind of a state his friend was in, and he had him taken to Washington College Hospital, where Poe slipped in and out of consciousness. He died 4 days later, early in the morning of October the 7th in 1849, and it is said that his last words were, "Lord, help my poor soul." He was buried the next day at Baltimore's Westminster Hall and Burying Ground, but his funeral service was very poorly attended, and the cause of his death at the time was put down as phrenitis, which meant inflammation of the brain, and apparently that was used to explain a death when the true cause wasn't really known. So, what actually happened to Edgar Allan Poe? You might be interested to know there are over 26 published theories on his demise so far. Part of the problem is no death certificate seems to have been filed, and if it was filed, it's certainly been lost. And that's not helped by a local newspaper which reported Poe's cause of death as congestion of the brain, which at that time was pretty much used as a polite euphemism for alcohol poisoning. What also didn't help, though, was that Poe had a literary rival. I told you he was going to have some, but this was one Mr. Rufus Griswold, and he wrote an obituary characterising Poe as some madman who wandered the streets and he had no morals, he was bankrupt and an alcoholic womanizer. It's interesting to note here, though, that Griswold signed that obituary Ludwig. Didn't even use his own name. Sadly, though, what he did write under his own name was the first biography of Poe, so as you can imagine, not a good image of him was painted, and that seems to be how the public thought of Poe for a long time. That image really was implanted there, and this horrible image of this poor man seems to have been the one that stuck for ages. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent. Back to the theories. What actually killed Edgar Allan Poe? Some think alcoholism, pure and simple, while others do put forward the idea that Poe had lesions on the brain. Maybe it wasn't one tumour, maybe there was a few. Maybe epilepsy, tuberculosis, cholera, or even syphilis. I mean, all of these have been put forward as possible causes. Then there are others who have speculated that Poe, who adored cats, by the way, and had one as a pet, that he died of rabies. Could it have been a simple case of something like flu or pneumonia? I mean, his fiancée did report he wasn't well before he took his last trip. There is also a theory, though, that he was beaten up by street gangs or even brothers of his fiancée, thinking there that they wouldn't have wanted their sister to become involved with an alcoholic pauper, after marrying so well the first time. I'm not sure about the last couple there, because that doesn't really explain why he appeared drunk and why he was in the wrong clothes. You're not going to beat somebody up, and as a result of that, they're just going to appear drunk, and then you're going to change the clothing. That doesn't ring true to me. But be it brain tumour, alcohol, rabies, whatever, there is one theory that seems to be the most common, and that is that Poe may have been a victim of couping. This was a common practice at the time, and in basic terms, it was election rigging. And nothing like election rigging would ever happen these days, would it? Of course not. In those times, Baltimore was apparently notorious for such things. So here's a rough description of how it happened. So you'd have crooked politicians, which luckily we don't have any of these days, but they would pay thugs to kidnap men off the streets, in particular those who were homeless or kind of down and out, down on their luck, that kind of man. And the victims would have all sorts of things happen to them. There's some reports they'd be taken away, tied up, drugged, given drink, all sorts of things. Some might have been beaten up. And then they're disguised, forced to go and vote over and over at different polling places for the chosen candidate, and then they'd be left for dead in the street. But each time they voted, they'd be taken out, their clothes would be changed, and they'd put into the next polling place, vote for them again, come out, change, and be made to do that over and over. And you can imagine, if you start to refuse, you're going to get beaten up, they would drug them again. I mean, they would have been in an absolute heck of a state, these men. But it was also commonplace for voters to be given a drink after they had voted. And when Poe was found, it was a voting day in Baltimore, and the pub he was found outside of was being used as a voting station, as was common in those days. So, is it possible Edgar Allan Poe had gone and voted, been given an alcoholic drink, remember, just one was enough to make him rolling drunk, then the couping gang saw him in a state, took him and made him repeat the process over and over, leaving him in such a drunken stupor it actually took his life? That would certainly explain the condition he was in when he was found and why he was dressed so oddly compared to his usual smart dressing that he was known for. And to be honest, at this point, the cooping theory makes the most sense to me, possibly combined with the brain tumour theory, which could be why he was unable to process alcohol in the first place. That's where I'm leaning. But do you agree? Do you have another theory, or have you heard something else which I clearly haven't? Whatever the case, let me know in the comments what you really think caused the death of Edgar Allan Poe. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of this week's episode. Thank you for your company this week, and don't forget to join me next week as I open another of the mystery files. But until then, you take care of your wee self. Stay away from corrupt politicians and weird polling stations and cooping gangs. See you next week.